In this video, I'll take you through the process I used to create this painting. I'll show you some of my favorite painting techniques and take you through my decisions as we go. I wanted to make something really special with this one because this painting will be on the front of the box for the custom gouache and watercolor brushes I'm creating with Craftamo. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in these brushes, and you can sign up to be notified when they're available. Let's start at the very beginning with a cup of tea and a sheet of cold pressed watercolor paper. This is 300-gram cotton paper, and I've made a sketch with pencil to mark the basic structure of the composition. For anyone interested, these are the reference images that I'm using for this painting. I took these photos on a walk last year, and I love painting scenes like this that just give you that wonderful warm feeling of summer. Compositionally, I'm mainly using the image on the left, but I also like on the vertical image how you can see more of those shadows on the bottom. I think that helps to create a nice frame effect, and it kind of pushes our eyes inward and towards the light in the distance. I'm starting off with my size 3 Quill Mop Brush. This is the largest brush in the set, and it's really useful in the early stages of the painting when you need to cover large areas. I pre-mixed a couple shades of blue using ultramarine, aqua blue, and white, and I'm just making some smooth horizontal strokes with the mop brush to create a gradient. I also wanted to mention that I did not pre-wet the paper here. I really wanted the color to be very intense and bright, and I didn't want it to be diluted. I have my paper sitting up on a desk easel, so it's tilted at a slight angle. You'll see that as the paint flows downward, the gradient will become a little bit more smooth and even. While the paint is still wet, I'm using a scrunched up paper towel to blot up the paint and give the impression of clouds. If the paint dries too fast, you can re-wet areas with clean water and then try again with the paper towel. This technique is so much fun, and my advice is to go with the flow. Don't worry about making the perfect clouds. The clouds look a lot more realistic and natural if they're not too clean. I really love the beautiful textures that happen there and the look of the clouds kind of dissolving into the sky. Next, I'm going to grab one of my favorite brushes in the set, the size 8 round brush. I'm loading up the brush with some white paint mixed with just a little bit of water to loosen it up. I don't always add white when I paint clouds, but for this scene, I wanted the clouds to be extra bright and luminous. I'm placing down the paint inside the cloud shape and then pushing the brush outwards. As the bristles splay out a little bit, they help to form a nice, organic, and slightly bubbly shape to the outside edge of the clouds. As I mentioned earlier, I really do like those soft areas too, so I'm trying to make sure I don't cover everything up with white. It's nice to have some variety of shapes as well, so I'm going to add some of these little tiny clouds breaking off of the larger ones. I also want to add some shadows to the clouds to make them look a little bit more three-dimensional. I'm using a light blue for the shadows. I want to keep that bright, happy, sunny day feeling. So I chose not to use any desaturated grays or anything too dark in the clouds. Just a little bit of light blue already works well enough to give them dimension and keeps that very happy and light feeling. After the shadows, I did one last pass of highlights on the clouds, just looking for any upward-facing edges that looked like they could use a little bit more. I hope you like how the clouds turned out. It's a little bit funny to see this piece of sky just like floating on the page like this, but we are about to get started on the surrounding areas. I'm preparing for the next step by wetting my paper first with the mop brush. I want to do some wet on wet painting so that I can get some nice soft blends and gradients in this area. I'm starting off with a light green, and I am following along my sketch, so I'm able to see which areas I had planned for the lighter grasses, and that's where I'm painting the light green. After the light green, I'll move into the darker mid-greens and then shadows. I really love this stage of the painting process because I find it satisfying to watch the paint spread out on the page. The paint's also a little bit more transparent because of the extra water, and it gets a really beautiful glow to it. As this darker green color comes in, I hope you can see the benefit of doing this wet and wet painting. We get these really nice soft transitions where the two colors are touching each other. This works especially well in a situation like this, where we're painting an area that's a bit further away from the viewer. So our eyes wouldn't necessarily see every detail the same way that it will with the foreground, and it makes sense for things to be a bit fuzzy back there. That said, I will use this same technique to paint the base of the foreground area. I think it's just a really good way to block in the basic foundation for what's going to be painted there. And then as we layer, we can bring in some hard edges, continue to detail, and things will come into focus. We're basically starting everything with a blurry version of the final painting. We are going to be painting the whole background layer with this kind of method of just getting these soft blends, getting the basic colors in, and then we will layer and sharpen up and bring things into focus in the specific areas where we want that to happen. And that will be the foreground and the focal area. If you remember when we were looking at the reference photos, I mentioned that I liked the shadow area on the bottom of the composition in the foreground, and that's what I'm working on here now. I'm currently using a color called dark green from Holbein. I'm mixing that dark green with a magenta and ultramarine blue to create this deep blue-green color that works really well in shadows for foliage. I especially like to use it in sunny day scenes because you get a lot of blue bounce light in the shadows. And I just really like that color temperature shift between the cool shadows and then the warm sunlight in the sunny areas. It helps to give that feeling of what it actually feels like to be outside on a nice sunny day with the warm grass, and then you stand under a tree and feel the cool breeze. You can feel the difference in temperature, and that's something that we can express in our painting with color temperature. This stage of the painting process can be tricky because we still have these large empty white spaces on the paper. That really throws off our ability to take in the balance of darks and lights in the scene and kind of understand where we're at in regard to values. I try my best not to get too detailed with any area of the painting too early, and I try to focus on putting at least a basic foundation color everywhere on the page. Once that's done, it's a lot easier to take in everything as a whole and see what might need to be adjusted and just understand where to go from there. If you take a look at my palette, you'll see I'm grabbing some white and blue paint along with the green that was already on my brush. I'm doing this because of the effect of atmospheric perspective. As objects are further in the distance, they'll appear a bit lighter and shifted a little bit more blue. At the bottom of my palette, you'll see a brown color that's called Tatia brown. It's similar to burnt sienna. Sometimes I like to mix that color with a green to get a nice warm and earthy looking green. There's many different varieties of greens in nature, and bringing that variety into your painting can make it look more lush and beautiful, and also bring more interest to an area that would otherwise just be like a big wall of one color. Here I'm grabbing some more of that darker green mix again and bringing that back in while the paint is still wet. So I'm letting the colors touch each other, letting them flow together and create those nice soft transitions between the lighter and darker areas. The bush and tree shapes are pretty bulky and dense. I find it easier with these distant objects to start with pretty basic shapes. Now that those basic shapes are in, I'm going to start adding branches and details reaching out from that. I want these trees to feel nice and airy, so I'm trying to leave some space in between the branching shapes. It can be very easy to go into autopilot and fill everything in, so I'm trying to remind myself to leave some of that nice negative space where we can see the sky. You can see the bottom of the paper is still shiny and wet, and I'm not sure if I'll need to rest my hand on that area while painting the top left, so I'm going to dry things first just to be safe. For this area, I'm using a similar approach to what I did over on the right, switching between green colors while the paint's still wet, that way they can blend together nicely. I'm actually being a little bit more loose over on this side, and I will show you why that is. Looking at the reference image, you can see on the left how there's just this big wall of foliage, and there's mid-greens, and then there's shadows, and then there's areas that are much lighter, all going up that wall of green, and there's all these subtle shifts in value. It's organic, it's messy, it's not clear when one bush ends and a tree begins. I'm trying to embrace that and not be too stressed about, the shadows being exactly in the same place as they are in the reference or anything. I'm just taking it as a main idea and trying to put that main idea into my painting. And if things are shifted a little bit here or there, then that's no problem. As I'm working on the outer edge of the foliage wall, I'm starting to make some leaf details on the outside, and I've switched over to my number 2 round brush. I absolutely love this brush because it has such a nice, sharp, pointed tip. And that's one of my favorite things about the Craftamo brushes. They really excel in making brushes with a fine and precise pointed tip, which I value a lot because you can have so much control over the details you paint and get a lot of nuance in your shapes. I also realized at this point in the painting, when I started painting these little grasses, that there's something that needs to go behind here, and it's going to be a lot easier if I paint that first. So I paused on the grasses for a bit and mixed up a lighter green for the distant tree line. As long as I keep that background foliage lighter and less saturated, it won't fight with the closer bushes on the left, and we'll be able to feel space between them. Also, I don't want that much detail going into the distant tree line because it is so far away, so I want to keep it fairly minimal because I don't want our attention getting stuck on that area. So now I want to introduce you to one of the coolest brushes in this set. It is a custom brush that I worked on together with Craftamo, and it's modeled after the brushes used in Japanese animation background painting. It has a special shape to the tip that can create these really cool splits in the brushstroke. Let me show you again at the side angle. They're great for painting grass and foliage, but also things like wood grain, and it just creates some really cool textures. I love having one of these brushes in my set for doing this kind of painting. I'm going to take some clean water and actually blur out some of what we just did. This is something I do occasionally when I want to layer foliage and want it to feel very messy and soft and intertwined. I'll paint a little bit, blur out, and then paint again on top of it once it's dry. It might seem a little odd and maybe I'm doing extra work, but I like the end result of how it looks. Continuing with the grasses, I'm slowly moving towards the focal area. I'm beginning by painting some larger shapes. These are going to be shadows on the grass around the pathway, and then I switched to a smaller round brush for some of those sharper grassy details. I also felt like it was time to bring the pathway up into this light area, so I mixed a little bit of the Tasha Brown with some white, and I started painting in some patches on the pathway. I wanted to make it feel like grass was blocking our view of the path a little bit here and there, so that's why I didn't paint it in a solid shape. I also wanted to bring some of that light down. I wanted it to feel like there was just a couple little streaks of light that were catching there before fading into the shadows. While that paint's still wet, I'm bringing in a darker brown and trying to blend that in softly. I really had to experiment here a bit. I was trying to work through the colors and values to figure out how bright should this pathway be as it moves into the sunlight. In a couple moments, I'm going to do some dry brushing on the path, so I wanted to talk about that. I really like the textures you can get from this technique. You can see here I'm holding my brush sideways against the paper and dragging it kind of lightly. It's really nice for this kind of situation because you can hint at gravel or a kind of gritty look. Maybe there's some stones on the path or it's uneven, but you can get a nice effect from just a couple of brush strokes. Earlier, when I brought in that clean water, I may have used a little bit too much. You can see the harsh edge that formed around some of those paint strokes. So as I'm adding the next layer of detail to those grasses, I'm just making sure to cover up that edge. While I'm painting the foreground, I like to try to keep things loose. And it's mainly because I like the sense of movement in the brushstrokes. So I try to keep a little bit of the loose and sketchy feeling when I'm painting, especially when I'm working on grasses or things that I want to have like a little bit of a windswept look to them. So the next thing I want to do is darken the foreground a little bit, but I also want to add texture. So I'm bringing in another layer of this dark green paint and making these scribbly type of brush strokes to give a grassy look to the edge of the shape. It's a little bit of a messy process, but it does look grassy in the end. So again, putting down the big shape first and then going back with a smaller brush and giving it those grassy edges. I'm trying to do this kind of loose painting, especially around the outer edges of the composition. You'll see later when I get to the focal area, I will definitely slow down. And in fact, some areas I paint quite slowly and carefully, so it has a lot to do with how loose or how detailed I want an area to be. Right now, I'm painting shadows on the right side of some of the grass tufts. The light is coming from the left, and so it's on the right side of the grass tufts that I want to put the shadow. It really helps to give some dimension there. So here I'm grabbing a light blue, purple, gray color. I wanted to add a little bit of a cool color onto the pathway. This is something that I noticed when I'm out on a walk and I see these like dusty type of paths in the shadows. You get a lot of blue bounce light from the sky. They have this nice blue, purple, periwinkle, really pretty color. And it's subtle, but I think it does a lot for the mood. Moving back into the lower area of the path, I wanted to do one more layer of dry brushing. I felt like things weren't quite as dark as they needed to be, so I just went back and forth a little bit with a very green-brown color. I just wanted to create a soft transition between the path and the grasses. There's a bit of an overgrown look in the reference images that I was using, so I didn't want it to be like a very clean path. I wanted it to be sort of dissolving into the grass. And of course, we have a little bit of purple bounce light in there too, a bit of a darker color than up above. Next up, I'm going to introduce you to another very handy brush in this set. This one is called a rigger brush. It's meant to help with long, thin lines. It's really great for things like grasses, stems, branches, or even things like power lines if you're painting city scenes. Anytime you need to do a long, thin line, this brush will help give you some stability. I use the rigger brush to create the base structure for this plant, sort of like a skeleton structure of stems. And now I've switched over to my number 2 round brush to add the tiny leaves onto those stems. I'm putting leaves at the top that are very separated and easily distinct from each other. And at the bottom of the plant, I'm kind of creating a mass where the leaves are so dense that you are just kind of seeing a big blob of leaves with some leafy shapes around the outside. And this is just from looking at the reference pictures. You can see that things get a lot more busy down at the base of the plant. So it just feels a lot more natural and helps the plant to kind of blend into the environment. Another thing I'm doing is adding some grasses coming up around the base, kind of just nestling it into the grasses there. So moving up to the bushes on the top right, one bush is kind of standing out as needing a little bit of love, so I'm painting a second layer on top of that one, just making some small brush strokes, kind of bubbly brush strokes. And I'm painting relatively transparent at the moment, just glazing in some little adjustments. I'm also going to be painting in some tree branches that are reaching outward, or I guess inward towards the middle of the composition. I decided that I wanted this frame of foliage to come in a little bit further. So I'm going to extend those leafy branches so that they kind of close in a little bit more on the center of the composition. And also just adding some leafy texture brush strokes around the edges of those bushes and trees. I've grabbed my rigger brush again and I'm painting the initial structure for some taller grasses and then moving up into some bushy plants. I can go back in with a larger brush and start painting the leafy foliage. Starting with larger brush strokes for the main bulky area of this bush, and then as I move to the outer edge, I'll switch to a smaller brush to paint the tiny details. I like working like this with foliage because you can really get a lot of impact when you focus the detail on that silhouette. Especially when you have a lot of contrast between the foliage and whatever's behind it. In this case, the sky and the grasses, which are lighter. The bush that I'm currently painting, and below it, I'm going to add some wildflowers that are not in the scene yet. This general area is going to be the focal area of the whole painting. So it's helpful to have not only the high contrast there, but also a larger amount of detail overall. So I'm looking at transition areas in the foliage. In this case, we have that medium green and the darker blue green, and I'm working on bringing some of those green leaves over top of the shadow color. It's really the same idea as the outer silhouette, even though we're inside of the bush shape, we're looking at the silhouette of that, green area. Around this point in the process, I started to feel like there was something missing. And, the painting's not done yet, of course, so there are certainly details that are missing. I was planning to add some lighter grasses and leaves coming up in front of that, central shadow area. But I really wanted this painting to be special, and I wasn't sure if that was going to feel like enough. My first thought was to add some wildflowers, like a little pop of color here or there, because that's always fun to do. And then I suddenly knew exactly what I had to add to this painting. If you're familiar with my work, this might not be a big surprise, but I absolutely love this plant here on the right, this poison hemlock or cow's parsley, these white flowers. They have such a pretty shape to them. Look at them in the sunlight. It's so pretty. I look forward to them blooming every year. They've been featured in many of my paintings, and they are just part of a lot of my, happy sunny day memories. Since this painting will be on the cover of the box for my custom brushes, I put a lot of thought into choosing the reference picture. I wanted this piece not just to represent my art, but also what the brushes can do. So I wanted to show the sky, I wanted to show the foliage, I wanted to have some things up close and some things far away. And then with adding these plants, that was a chance to put in a little extra of a personal touch and also just get more creative with the composition. Let me know in the comments what you think about this edition. And also, I'm curious if you guys have a special plant or flower that you look forward to blooming each year. Getting back to the painting process, you saw me use the rigger brush again to create the structure of the plant. Since these flowers are in the shadow, I chose a color to represent the cool bounce light from all the greens and the blues from the sky. This is something that I love about this flower, and it's any white flower really. The contrast between how they look in the shadows and how they look in the sunlight when there's this direct sun on them and they're just glowing. The contrast is really beautiful, and I feel it's most beautiful when you have a scene that includes the flowers in both places, rather than having them all in the shadow or all in the light. It gives a more convincing sense of depth because our brains just inherently know that there's space between those two things because of the change in lighting, that they're located in two different areas with two different lighting situations. And this is true for any object of any color that's sitting in the shadow versus sitting in the sunlight. You're always going to have a shift in value, lighter or darker, and a shift in hue as well. It just so happens that with white objects, the effect is going to be extra dramatic. I want to share one more new brush with you now. This is the 1/2 inch angled flat brush. There are 6 brushes total in my set, and for me a flat brush is an absolute must-have, which is kind of interesting because I don't use it in every single painting, but for certain things I absolutely love to have it. If I ever paint architecture, for example, or any man-made things really, anything that has like square edges or bricks or something like that, I find it really, really useful to have a flat brush. Aside from that, I do like to use flat brushes to paint organic subjects and to give interesting textures and paint strokes. Here I'm using it to do that around the outside edge of the composition. I want like a loose painting kind of look, so I'm just making some brush strokes here and there, and I think that adds a lot of movement. I also like how you can kind of paint with just the tip or the point. It'll give you a really dramatic, thin, thick kind of effect. In a little bit, I'm going to paint the leaves on the foreground flowers, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm just taking a quick break from that area while things dry, and I'm going to do some last bits of polishing on the upper part of the composition. Hopefully not too much. It can be hard sometimes to know when you're done and to stop yourself from overworking things. I feel like this is an ongoing journey and learning experience for me as an artist. I know I'm not alone in this too, and that does help me feel better. I've talked to a lot of you guys in my live streams and stuff, and I feel like this is a very common issue. So yeah, we'll just keep doing our best and learning, and I think with time it gets a little bit better. But it's a puzzle every time, and that's a good thing. That's part of what makes it fun. It's time to paint some leaves with the flat brush. You can see how I'm holding the brush so that I'm kind of painting with just that top corner. If you look at the tip compared to how wide the brush could actually be if you placed it down flat, you can see how dramatic of a thin to thick effect you can get as you push the brush down. So I like this because it kind of brings in some happy accidents, as Bob Ross would say. Sometimes the marks I get when I'm pressing down will be slightly unexpected, slightly more organic. And so I like to use it when painting certain types of ferns and certain types of leaves. Nature isn't necessarily perfect, and that's beautiful. I know I have the tendency sometimes when I'm detailing to picky and over rendering things instead of finding ways to hint at shapes and textures. Of course, these are just personal preference things, and it has to do with what's inspiring me now at this moment with my art, but that's just one additional way I like to use the brush that I thought might have been kind of unexpected, and I wanted to share in case anyone else might have fun with that. So right now I'm adding some highlights. I'm doing this dots and dashes technique that I explain a little bit more in another leaf painting video I've made, and I'll link that. But basically I'm just taking a slightly lighter color than the base of the leaves and adding little dots and dashes where there would intuitively feel like there should be a highlight. So on the top edge of the leaves, or maybe along where the veins of the leaves would be, things like that. Now I'm just continuing to add detail in the foreground. Since the value got pretty dark here, I'm able to use a mid-value green and actually paint some plants coming out of the shadows. And you can see here they're mostly little dots and then some lines for grasses. So the foliage here is very layered and chaotic, which is what I wanted. I wanted it to feel very lush and messy and lots of plants intertwined. So I'm just going through right now by feel and seeing, where I can add a little extra here or there. When you're painting highlights in areas like this, they of course need to be light enough that they're a highlight compared to what you're painting them on. But one thing that I'm trying not to do is make them too bright, because this area still needs to look dark overall. It still needs to feel like this is in shadow. So the highlights, as far as the reflected light and bounce light, it's important that they're lighter but not competing with stuff that's in the sunlight. Painting negative spaces or shadows in between the leaves is also a nice way to add depth to foliage. So this is that color from earlier. It's like a dark green mixed with a little magenta and ultramarine blue. I've watered it down a lot and just dropping in some little dots of it here and there, maybe under leaves. Just think about where shadows could be. And it feels like you're seeing deep inside the lush foliage. We're finally getting to the point of adding highlights to the focal area, the grasses and flowers that are going to be coming up into the sunlight. I've mixed a color that matches the lighter color of the grass, and it's a little bit of yellow, white, and just a touch of spring green. When doing this kind of layering, it's really important not to use too much water. Yellow is a very transparent color, even in gouache, so the white helps a lot in making it a solid color that will cover the darker layer below. But you have to use a pretty dry mix to get the proper coverage, so too much water will be too transparent. I was a bit nervous painting these brushstrokes here because they just felt so bold in front of the shadows, and I really wanted them to look nice. It helped a lot to have the rigger brush, and once I got through the first couple grasses, then I felt better. It was actually quite satisfying to see these highlights come up in front of that shadow. There was so much setup that had to go into the painting before getting to this point, but I feel like it was all worth it. Once I got into the flow and wasn't scared anymore, it was so much fun to do. I feel like this plant specifically coming up into the light really did a lot for selling the whole lighting situation in this painting. I wanted to bring some highlights down to that transition area between the shadow and highlight. I thought that would be a nice area to have some extra detail and just the last little sparkle of light before, coming into the shadows. So there was one more element of the painting that I had to gather my bravery for, and that was the flowers right on top of the poison hemlock. I wanted to make these tiny, delicate details as thin as I possibly could. At first I painted what would be the green part of the stems and those little branching areas. I'm not sure what the flat or anatomy is called, but you can see how much slower and more carefully I'm painting this plant because it will be the focal point and an area that gets a lot of attention. So compared to the flowers in the foreground, a little bit more time and careful focus. After that, I switched over to a pure white and started dotting in the flower tops, and this was probably my favorite part of the whole painting. This is what I was talking about earlier. These flowers here in the sunlight, that glow, that little pop of white. Lighting scenarios like this inspire me so much. I just love seeing it when I'm out in nature too, especially the dappled lighting, and when you have that situation where there's just a magical highlight on a plant, like a little spotlight. I love noticing that when I'm out and about, and I end up taking pictures of a million random plants, but they always come in handy for painting reference, so it's not a bad thing. I want to point out here I'm using a darker green to paint the bottom of this plant that comes in front of the light area. That way we're still able to see it, because if I continued with that yellow, it would just disappear into the highlight. So the top of the plant in front of the shadow is light, and the bottom of the plant in front of the light is darker. And if we move just below that, we sort of have the opposite situation happening. We have one of these darker, like more in shadow plants, and it's kind of disappearing. So I want to lighten the background so that we have the darker plant in front of the lighter background. This will make it a little bit easier to see what's happening there. This is one great thing about using gouache. You know, I enjoy painting in watercolor too, but I love working with gouache because of the flexibility of being able to change something like this so late in the process and being able to paint light over dark like this. I wanted to add some more leaves up in that highlight area. I felt like I already had a lot of grasses, but there wasn't enough variety of texture and shapes. So I wanted to bring in some little circular leaves and just hint at little plants growing among the grass. On these bushes over on the left, I also added some branches poking out. I just felt like that was missing. I looked back at the reference picture and I was like, you know what? I have these big masses, which is good. I wanted to kind of simplify them, but I felt like it was missing that feeling of like some of those branches reaching out into the sunlight. So I added a couple of those here and there and tried to think about where the light might be hitting them, things like that. The last detail I added to this painting was just a tiny bit of highlight to the distant grasses, just like a little bit of shimmer back there. That brings us to the end of the painting process. I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me for this process. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you got some insight into how I created this painting and why I created this painting, the thoughts behind it. I really enjoyed getting to share my custom brushes with you. We've been working hard on these brushes for months and I'm so happy with how they came out. If you're interested in getting one of these sets, they are limited edition, so I'll put a link below and you can sign up if you want to be notified when they're available. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been so supportive and excited about this project. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you next time.